Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds, by nerds, I'm Nerdist Dave, and today I'm hanging out with Matt Corley. Hopefully, I am pronouncing that correctly. I usually try to ask beforehand. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great and you pronounced it just right. Thank you.
Perfect. So, before we jump into it, let's start off with if you could tell folks a little bit about yourself. I've got D&D and horror in the title, so that kind of is a little bit of an indicator. But
Right.
I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, so I am a game designer and an author. For the D&D side of things, I am a writer developer for Cobalt Press. I did Tales of the Old Margrave. I did a fair amount of stuff for Deep Magic, and then another project that they have coming in the next year, hopefully. And then what I probably do the most for on the fifth edition side, other than my own work, of course, is Sandy Peterson. So most folks know Sandy, or at least know the name Sandy from Call of Cthulhu, since he wrote it initially or originally back in the 80s, late 70s. Kind of the second oldest game. And Sandy and I have co-authored two adventure paths, so that's 8 books. And then I also did the development for a third adventure path, which was another four for him. And two of those are out. The third one's close to coming out. So I do a lot of horror writing with Sandy. Um, but I think what most folks know me for is probably Whispers in the Dark, maybe a little bit Lamplight Sanitarium, but they're both, again, Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition products that really focus on investigational elements, horror elements, gothic elements within the game that that aren't explored as much as they could be for kind of a variety of reasons. So I think that's what it is mostly. Whispers in the Dark especially has been really great this year. MT Black and I co-wrote some quick start rules back in January, and it's already a gold bestseller, so doing really well. And we had a successful Kickstarter as well.
So horror is one of the genres that I find really difficult in a game like Dungeons and Dragons. Um, can you throw out some tips for us to running a successful horror game with D&D?
Yeah, so the easiest thing would be to buy Whispers in the Dark, obviously.
Step one.
There's my pitch. But you know what? I think there's a lot of different ways you can do it. And what I've found that works best is to really introduce consequences to players, player characters that last more than a short rest. I think that's probably the biggest, easiest one that folks kind of struggle with is, I've been playing D&D since 83, I think, 1983, 84. And these days you can fight a red dragon or whatever. You can be down to, it can basically kill you. You come right back up with 0 hit points or 1 hit point, stabilize, and then you sleep 8 hours and you're perfect. Nothing happened to you. And that takes a lot of the horror element out of it because it takes out consequences, long-term consequences especially. And so I think that's one of them. The other one is, in a lot of ways, Dungeons and Dragons, and this isn't a knock by any means, is about accumulation of personal power by a PC. They get better. They get a lot better. They have some fairly significant jumps at 5th level, tier 3, and then at tier 4, which I have written a few tier 4 adventures too. It's pretty hard to actually really challenge them unless you get really creative, which you certainly can. But in Whispers, we took away classes, which took away a lot of the buffs and the features that folks get, and we gave everybody a D6. That's another thing. So you can kind of there's little things that on one hand kind of seem big, but on the other hand really aren't as challenging from a DM. So it's stuff it's rules you're familiar with as a GM or a player, and you're just doing a slight tweak. And probably, again, the biggest thing that we did was I wrote sanity rules for Lamplight 2 years ago, and those do actually introduce long-term consequences. Those are not things that go away with a long rest. Some don't go away with a month rest.
So is that the for like the Cthulhu stuff you've done? How do you make people be afraid of Cthulhian horrors? When in D&D, like it's your job essentially to kill monsters, so it's like whatever slurpy slurpy tentacle thing, you're just another monster.
Right. That's exactly it too. And I think you kind of touched on something, is that it's the expectations of the players and the DMs And to be perfectly honest, the writer and the designer too. If I want to make a game that has horror elements or investigation elements or both, I have to write that game. That's it too. It's not just the rules. The rules are a skeleton that we all use. But kind of to paraphrase, the rules aren't the thing. The story is the thing, and the way I write the rules is the thing, or the way we write the story is how it is. And again, making sure that there is a consequence. We basically removed magic too from Whispers, so you're not getting resurrected. Once you get Revivify, you get a nice kind of safety cushion, and then once you have resurrection, you really don't have any consequences anymore. At least in regular D&D, you can kind of do whatever you want. And then, of course, Adventure Leagues play used to always let you get a free resurrection and things like that.
Yeah, so for me too, it's like part of it is like the consequences. Like, as a player, maybe they don't feel as strongly that way, but also setting the mood and getting the buy-in, right? I mean,
oh, absolutely.
I think like part of the trick is trying to figure out how to do that without like death being the only stick you have in your toolbox to use.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that was when we did the play testing for Whispers, especially, we had I think about 80 different folks do it, and we wrote a little like a one pager that said, okay, this is what this game is. This is what this game is not. I know, especially when I first started mentioning Whispers, I used to say this is D&D, but it's investigational horror D&D, and at this point, I've kind of even stopped mentioning Dungeons and Dragons in it. Because it's not Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, it uses the rules, but like you said, the players and the GM need to understand that if you go, you're in New Orleans in one of our adventures, and if you go to New Orleans and somebody makes you mad and you shoot them, you go to jail, or you get beat up by the cops and then you go to jail. It's not D&D, it's not like you can sit there and it's okay to walk around with a broadsword on your back in full plate armor. All these things are different, and it's very narrative driven, which helps that. And again, like the insanity rules that I wrote, or the madness rules, are a little different. There's 4 levels instead of just 3. There's narrative consequences, or there's narrative, I don't know, crunch isn't the right word for that, but there's crunch and there's narrative aspects to it. So you might, and in some cases you might actually get a bonus. So like if you're really jittery, you actually might get a little bit of a bonus to initiative. But you also might get a penalty to fear checks.
Yeah.
So it's not 100% bad. And I think too, one of the things I talked to a lot of folks about is, I spent 8 weeks when I was in school to be a pharmacist and a psych ward. And I have worked with psychiatric medicine before, and I use a lot of the experiences that I learned there in those descriptions of those. And then again, personal things too, stuff that I personally have challenges with occasionally. And I think a lot of folks have those challenges too. And we try to be very respectful with it. But again, it's part of that game, and it's an optional part, of course, but it definitely introduces that consequence, which a lot of folks really, really like.
So Whispers in the Dark, it's fair to say, is more of a D&D or 5e hack than playing D&D, which, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and we're going to do, so I'll be doing a core rule book. I'll do a Kickstarter for it probably about 3 or 4 months, so October-ish, November. And it's going to be a D20 game. We'll use the SRD, but it's going to be rewritten fairly significantly because, again, no classes and that sort of thing. But that said, if you know how to play Dungeons and Dragons and you have a filled-in character sheet in front of you especially, you'll be able to play Whispers in minutes.
Yeah, I mean, and that is kind of the strength of hacking another system that people are already familiar with. They can jump in and start playing. There's definitely plenty of games that are like that I've played, and that it makes it super easy. I mean, when we were looking for a superhero game to play way back when, and it was like between Mutants and Masterminds or Champions, we're like, oh, we understand D20, so we'll just play this game. The whole group can shift over fairly easily, so it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And Monty Cook and Wizards and Chaosium actually did do a D20 Call of Cthulhu back in. I have a hard copy behind me somewhere. Yeah. And it's a pretty interesting book. It's a very different book,
Yeah.
but I really like it. It's really neat. It didn't get, it has a handful of, adventures, scenarios for it, but it has been done before. But again, like you said, starting with D20, where almost everybody knows the rules, helps. And to be perfectly honest, I know the rules. I mean, I've been playing D&D for 30 years. So that helped me. That, I talked about that. One of my other things with the design aspect is it's a game that I've played long enough and know well enough that I'm able to adjust it relatively efficiently on my part, which makes the playtesters much easier and everybody else's start too easier.
Is there any other systems you tinker around with outside of D&D?
D&D is certainly the most, the D20. So I know how to play a bunch of different ones, kind of. Anything from like Warhammer, Pathfinder 1 and 2 a little bit. Obviously Call of Cthulhu as well. I did a little bit of I wrote a thing for Chaosium about a year ago that I think will come out next year. But I found that honestly, the more I look at the D20, especially the current version of the SRD, it's actually a lot more flexible than I think folks give it credit for. And again, the way I've always approached it, I approach it with more of an emphasis on the writing and the design elements within the adventure than the actual game itself, or the actual mechanics of it. I would love to write for Trail or Gumshoe. I think Gumshoe is really neat.
Mm-hmm.
Monster of the Week is really neat. I think a lot of those games are really cool. I just haven't had a chance to do really a whole lot of writing for them yet.
Yeah, I mean, even us as creators only have so much time,
Yes.
And it's like the prospect of learning a new rule set is so daunting, even for us that are kind of like in the know.
Right.
So I get why people kind of default to a single system.
Right.
And like for me too, like if I'm gonna play fantasy, I'm probably not gonna go away from D&D, even though there's a bunch of great systems out there that are doing fantasy. If I'm gonna go away from D&D, I'm probably just gonna go to a different genre altogether and play a different type of game. But I mean that's just me.
No, I agree. I agree totally. Actually, we know how to play D20, so if it's D20 based, we can fake it.
Yeah, it's basically, we're looking at Cortex right now because it's way different. We're looking at, we just started playing The Expanse, which is based off of the Age system. But like when we go in those directions, we just tend to go in completely different genres. So, the thing you just mentioned about D&D, like being more flexible, like we see a bunch of mechanics that just aren't being tapped into, but they're there,
Yes.
right? They do a very limited thing, and we keep going, well, why haven't these been expanded yet? We've done a little bit. We by no means were we the first to do it. There was another company that did it before us, as we were like doing it, they had already like had something published, where we took we made a supplement called Hit Dice to Heroics, and it was just like, well, this hit dice mechanic is really cool, but it only does one thing. Why couldn't it do other things in the game? And especially like the way we play, like short rests don't come up that much. We don't play super combat heavy games. So, like, those hit dice rarely get used. So we came up for some rules for some other ways to use them.
Yep. And you know what? So that's funny you say that. So I wrote, and it's on the website, so I can say the name of it. So for Sandy, the third adventure pass I wrote for him, but the second one him and I wrote together, that we authored together, is Dark World. It'll come out at the end of this year, I think. And the players end up in Yoggoth at, like, first level. And so they're stuck in an alien world. And one of the things I do, especially with Sandy's game, is I don't really give people magic items, hardly at all. I'm super stingy when I'm writing anyway, and I always tell the DM on the sidebar somewhere, like, you do what you got to do. You need to add stuff, add stuff. But one of the things that I wrote for that game that I was really, really excited about was using Tuckle, which is like a kind of a metal, an exotic metal that you channel your hit dice through to do magical effects. And so again, you spend your hit dice, and actually I'm going to use that in Whispers as well, because I like the magic system fine, but it doesn't fit the genre or the world that I'm building for Whispers. So magic is going to be, at least one version of magic is going to be hit dice driven. Because you're right, nobody uses your hit dice. I mean, if you get short rests, and depending on what you are, you don't need them. And if you get long rests, you don't need them either. So I thought, you know what, that's such a cool mechanic, like you said, that is just completely ignored. And using it to drive magic effects or even features and sacrificing parts of your own willpower or your soul or whatever narrative you're using to do these cool things is really neat. And it adds a resource management challenge to the players and the DMs, which makes the game, again, I think I like DM being more challenging and more difficult. You know, I don't mind my player character. I always say players. I don't mind my player characters, you know, dying. And even if it's permadeath, you know, in my campaigns, we tend to have a permadeath probably about every 2 months. And it is what it is. It's not a big deal. And the players always like it because, one, they get better and they learn the game. But also, it's just kind of part of the story and the way that we play.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like in the current like gaming climate, especially the D&D community, it's very, very frowned upon. But like me and you, it sounds like we started much closer, you know, to the same time period where we started playing, where it was literally just part of the game. And it just depends on your group, right? If your group is down for that, then it's fine. Like, come with a stack of characters, let's play the game. If they're not, you know, like we've said it plenty of times, there's tons of groups out there, and sometimes it's just a matter of finding the right group that matches your play style.
Right.
You know, or you know, and now like we're in this golden age of RPGs where you have lots of choices. You know, when we started playing, unfortunately, there wasn't. Like, if your play style did not match the groups or the GMs, tough. Like, if you wanted to play, this is what you were going to do.
Yeah.
And it wasn't generally, I don't think it was open for discussion.
No, it's so funny. I was talking to somebody about, it's like I mean, even when I played in high school, like, yeah, the internet wasn't a thing, for one thing. So you had to be very careful about who you said, yeah, I don't know what that game is, or maybe not. I don't want to, you know, you had to be, everybody was kind of, you know, kind of cautious about who they told they knew how to play games and not. Back then, you got what you got. And if you got anybody, you were pretty excited for it.
Yeah, you know, and like when I first, like, I'm mystified when I find someone that's like close to my age and started playing when I did, and they're like, yeah, we would go to our gaming shop, and we're like, you got a gaming shop? Like, I was much older before I saw an actual gaming shop for gaming stuff that wasn't a comic book store that had like a rack of D&D stuff, or like my go-to when I was a kid was B. Dalton and Walden Books, which I don't think either of those
Walden was awesome.
None of those exist anymore.
Well, it's funny though you say that. So there is a game shop, big Games Plus in Mount Prospect, Illinois, is amazing. And it's funny because you say that, because they were the first game store I ever went to, and I went to them in like 1993 or so. They're still open.
Oh, nice.
And I don't live in Chicago anymore. This was in high school. But whenever my kids and I go up to Chicago to shop or visit or do whatever else, because we go up there once or twice a year, I make them go to that store.
Yeah.
And I even talk to them. It's funny because they actually bought, 10 copies of one of the books I did for Friends of Kids with Cancer, Harper's Tale, and they're selling it on their shelves. And it's the best thing about them is they keep their overstock forever. So they have rows and rows and rows of the oldest stuff you've ever seen. If they didn't sell it, they just keep it forever. And they back Kickstarters. You can find anything. Their Cthulhu section, as you can imagine, is like huge, because there's 7 editions and it's been going on for 30 years. And the D&D section has everything from the red books to first, second, third and half. I mean, it is wild. I love that store. But anyway, yeah, you're right. Yeah, that was the only game. I mean, I found that one in junior and high school, and I still go because it's so good.
I don't know if that's a great business model to have all that merchandise sitting around. Maybe they're just laundering money. Who knew?
Whatever works. It's still there. 30 years later, I'll take it. I'm happy.
Yeah, now it's a straight up game store.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And they do wargaming,
Yeah.
which they probably were wargaming back then. I'm trying to think if I'm sure they have magic stuff too, but it's a hobby store. I mean, it's like the old school hobby stores that were like basically
Oh, like
museums
model
and war
planes
games.
and stuff like that as
Yeah,
well.
and I don't think they have model planes anymore. I'm trying to remember. I
Yeah.
don't go on that side. I just stick on my half.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, the other thing too is even those stores that we did had, like, there was a couple comic book stores, but even
mhm.
those were like dark, dingy holes in the wall. It was like
Yep.
going to a porn shop, to be honest with you. They're like, like there was no lighting. Any windows they had would be covered with posters, so it was just dark. And they weren't like well kept, and
No.
like it's
They had
like
that smell.
yeah,
They all
yeah.
smelled like wet cardboard.
Yeah, but then like we finally got one, not too far off, from where I live, and like the whole front of the building was nothing but glass, and not postered over, so, and the layout was open, it was
Hmm.
kind of like comic book store slash gaming store, but like they only had like the current comics. They didn't keep like back issues or anything like that. So I wouldn't say it was it wasn't exactly a comic book store, but like my my non gaming father-in-law would go in there for doing raffles and different charity things. And he's like, oh, I actually like going into this store, even though like this isn't my people, isn't my place, right?
Right.
I mean, we're finally starting to get those, and that's what the hobby needs: is open, welcoming spaces that make you want to be there, and not feel like you're making some kind of clandestine deal when you're just like going shopping.
Yeah, you still see those throwbacks every once in a while. Actually, yeah, I know of one that I can think of that's not too far from where I am now, and they do. They have shelves that go up like 20 feet that
Yeah,
have old moldy boxes of stuff. You don't even know what it is. And they have one or two people sitting behind the counter that just don't even look up when you come in. And it's my my partner. She would not go in. Like I went. I got her to, she's very supportive and doesn't mind that I do all this stuff. And we went once because it was closer to her house at the time. And she walked in and then walked out. She's like, "I'll meet you. I'll just wait for you in the car."
yeah, yeah.
It was just so nasty.
But thankfully things are changing, but we still have some of those throwbacks, those dinosaurs
Yeah.
left. And you just
That
wonder,
place has a great selection. They did have a great selection though.
what they think. Like, why don't you realize how dim and dank and like creepy this place is
Yeah.
for the normal
Oh, yeah,
people?
definitely.
It's almost like they're like, how can I keep people out of my store? I
Right,
know.
exactly. Yep.
But I digress a little bit. So we talked a little bit like mechanics and stuff when it comes to running horror. What do you do? What do you do differently narratively?
You kind of try to there's a fine line between over explaining and under explaining, and you want to leave enough gaps that the player's imagination and fills it in. And then you can even ask them sometimes, like, well, what do how does what do you see, or what do you feel, or what do you smell? That's something I try to do, and sometimes I'm better at it than other times. Is we always describe what something looks like, but we don't always remember to say like what it smells like. You have five senses. There's a reason they're there, and to use them, I think those are great. I personally am a huge fan of good box text. I will very specifically say good box text, because especially since you've been playing this as long as I have, you know that there's a lot of really bad box text too. My personal, when I'm writing box text, I try to keep it to basically one breath, maybe two, and very, very evocative. I do not say you see this. I describe it as if it's in like in a novel or something like that. And I think that helps too. And giving characters, again, personalities. I think all those things help. Nothing stops it and kind of breaks the mood like a monologue that you get in a game. And that can be written monologue from the text or a monologue from the DM. Either one happens, and both just kind of break the game. Or not break the game, but break the immersion a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think I even like sometimes when you'll see instead of all the box text being delivered at once, it's like segmented for the scene, so it gives the players kind of a chance to interact, and then you give them some more. You give them some, they interact. Give them some more, they interact. And it's not just like you said. It's at a certain point you just begin. It's like a monologue because your box text paragraphs. There's 5 of them. It's this long.
Well, right. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, by the time you get to the 5th paragraph, they've forgotten what you said in the first one. So.
Yep. And that's actually exactly. So when I write it out, I use kind of a variation on almost like a screenplay template where you have, the top entry. My encounters start off with there's a sentence that kind of tells the DM this is where or when or how this is going to happen. Then I have a box text, and it's funny. I literally look it on a computer screen, and if it's more than an inch long, I'm like, okay, I think I have too much here.
Yeah.
And then the next one is a little paragraph that's for the DM. Then the next point is basically what kind of things can happen, like skill checks or investigations, all that kind of stuff. Then depending on those skill checks, then like you said, you might have another little box text. If they do X, then read this. If they go too wide, then read this. And then underneath that, you'll have you'll have like monsters or whatever. And then even underneath that, you'll have like treasures or whatever. And I think being for me, maybe it's the pharmacist in me being a little bit anal retentive, but it actually helps me write it and it helps me organize it. For any DM, I've had a few folks say that this stuff that I write it for beginner DMs, and I feel like I just write it for any DM because it doesn't matter if you've been doing this for 6 months, 6 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. We all want to do it efficiently, and we all want to do it better. And that's what it is. It's not necessarily that I'm trying to write something for a beginner. I'm trying to write it so it's efficient and easy for the DM who has a pretty hard job. And again, anything you can do to make their job better or easier is something I like to try to do anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're going to write box text and you look at it and go, oh, the DM is just going to paraphrase this, then know it's way too long.
Well, exactly. And I mean, I've written with a lot of other folks, and there's a few folks that I really like that are very, very good that do like to do a monologue. And I can think I've written one monologue. And somebody asked me it the other day how many words I've written in the last 2 years, like published words, like, for Sandy or myself or, Wolf King or whoever. And I think I'm right at about 500,000. And in 500,000 words, I've written I can only think of one monologue in 500,000 words. And it was probably 3 inches of text. So maybe 300 words total. And I think that's about the right ratio is 0.1% of your writing should be a monologue. I think it's about right. Because again, I want the DM, if they're paraphrasing it or if I keep it short and evocative, then they can paraphrase it a little bit as well on the fly, and it'll be better.
And it doesn't sound like you're reading the box text, right? Isn't that like the goal for most DMs to convey the box text without it feeling like you're conveying the box text?
Exactly. James and Tricasso and a couple other folks are using bullets on occasion, and I like that. I that's how I write it actually in my notes. A lot of the times is I write bullets and then I connect them.
Yeah.
I think bullets are great actually. I think that's a fantastic alternative to box text if that's what you like. But I always like to give box text so they can see they get a better idea what's in my head when I'm writing it.
Yeah, the one argument, because I actually I invoke James often, especially when we're talking about box text because of his movement to do away with it.
Yeah, me too. It's fun.
But no, one writer they brought up a good point of like the box text to me is to let the players know and the dungeon master know what I feel is important in that scene. And what kind of to convey what I'm thinking about that particular scene. Then the trick, is to marry that concept with your concept of, how do we do this as concisely as possible and not bog down into a monologue.
Right. And I think too, part of me almost wonders, like I think it was Adventure League that used to say that you needed to have, what was it, like 10,000 words for 2 hours of play or some insane like ratio of text to time played.
Yeah.
And I can't disagree with that more for all sorts of different reasons. I mean, one, as a publisher, I really don't want to I don't want to publish 20 pages of text for 2 hours. that's bad. That's just bad business. Also, I seem to remember. I think it was Rob Schwab that really got me noticing that his adventures for Shadow of the Demon Lord, which is a really fun, really interesting game as well, are short. There's some that are 3, 4, 5 pages long. But they're good and they're interesting, and Rob can be really efficient with his adventure design when he wants to. And even Sandy, one of the best Call of Cthulhu adventures ever, and I'm totally blanking it now, which everybody that plays Call of Cthulhu is gonna be like, how did you forget the name of this? But it's in the book itself, in the 7th edition book, is only like 8 pages long. It's a couple thousand words, and it's a classic, and I am totally blanking it right now. I'd probably remember it if you had asked and I hadn't started talking. But you can be very efficient with text. I tell people, 300, 400 words is about 500 words is a page, roughly. That can be at least 30 minutes of play, easily.
I believe Bonnie Cook, they do 1-page adventures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that, and even Savage Worlds does those. I'm doing broadsheets now for Whispers, where they're basically 3 pages long, and it's just kind of whatever it is. Sometimes they're adventures, sometimes they're not going to be, but again, you can totally do it. Does your player is the player going to find out that wizard was there 20,000 years ago and had a pet named Joe that loved cheese and all? These incredibly lengthy backstories that nobody knows, that doesn't actually affect anything.
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of have different feelings on why that's there. But again, I think it creates challenges for a lot of folks that just aren't there. It doesn't need to be there, and you get bloated.
Yeah, as a GM, it's the balancing act of figuring out what's relevant, what's important to the players, and kind of fulfilling your own enjoyment. You can do that if you want. Just know that you're doing it for yourself, and right. and not the players, because they're probably never going to find that out if they even get to that portion of your content. But I say the same thing about players and their backstories, right? I'm like, if you want to write 8 pages of backstory, do it for yourself, but don't expect anyone else to care. It's just give me the crib notes of that backstory if I'm GMing that character.
Right.
I don't need 6 players handing me that much. That's a book.
Right. And I think that's a good point. It's for the player, if that's what you need or want to do and that's what you enjoy, you should do it. It's not, you should do what you enjoy and what makes you enjoy the game more. And if that's part of your process, I think that's fantastic. And I think, to your point too, is to be kind of considerate of your DM's time, and say, here's 1 or 2 things I would like to explore. And I've had my players do that, and I know 1 or 2 would do that, would write 5,000 words. But I'm like, okay, well, we need to condense that. Give me 1 or 2 things that you think is interesting or whatever it is. And that's what I will use, or that's what I will do my best to incorporate in some way, shape, or form. I don't, and I know this probably surprises some people, I don't write backstories for my players, usually, my characters, usually. I make it up on the fly as I'm going, and then try to remember what I said, and I'll write notes as I go. But I don't get to play a ton anyway anymore, but that's probably why. But again, and I think it's great for the players. But again, like you said, I think you need to remember to kind of make it digestible for the DM too, because that person's going to have 5, 6, 7 of those.
Yeah, I'm all for the fluid backstory as well. I think it's more fun, for me personally, to make it up as we go. Maybe I have 1 or 2 things that I'm going to bring up, and if we start play and something more interesting happens, then I'll even chuck those. I'm not married to it. I do whatever I think is fun in the moment. I like to let my characters develop as the game develops, instead of coming with this completed character that may not fit into the story or the world that we're playing in. I've had that happen where I get bored of my characters because I figured them out so much. We start playing, and it sounded like a great idea at the time, but then it just isn't. It's kind of lame or boring to play through.
Right. So that's kind of what we did. So with the sanity rules I wrote, you remember from the DMG, they were 2 pages maybe, and it's mostly a table and a picture.
Yeah.
The sanity rules I have are, I think depending on which version I'm looking at, 66 or 7,000 words with tables. And so those rules and the different aspects and ways it manifests can build personality and change the personality and change the way you play the character, so you get more depth to the character, which is, I think for a lot, maybe not for everybody, but I think for a lot of folks makes it more fun. And then the other thing that I did with Whispers, and this is actually a free Kickstarter update on Horror in the Windy City, is the alignments. And I did alignments totally differently. It's for folks that played like the old Palladium games, they'll remember in like, Anarchist alignment, Aberrant and Miscreant and whatever else there was. So this one is based on different kind of axes of good and evil, order and chaos, selfish and selfless. So there's kind of 6 axes, and then you're on them. And you don't pick all 3. You can pick 1 or none right at the beginning, and then you can move with life events. So let's say you end up getting captured by the cultists and go through a horrific experience. Well, maybe your alignment shifts because of that. Or maybe you are rescued in the middle of a forest by a goddess, or I don't know, a ghoul, who knows. And again, your alignment might shift to a different way. So it's much more nuanced, and again, it helps build the character as you're playing them. I love building it as I'm playing too, because then you can change it as it happens when you're, because when the story, you don't know the story ahead of time. And so I may not know how one of my friends is going to react, or how the DM is going to bring something up, and I say, but I'm your long lost cousin, or something, just, whatever you want to do, and say, well, I do remember that from my childhood. And it kind of goes from there. I think that makes it so much more fun. And I like it shifting. I do. I like the fact that alignment, and again, like your mental stability, or I don't know if that's the right word for it, but your persona and your personality can shift as you play, because they should. If you think about the stuff that these characters go through, if you take a step back, and one of my friends did this, he tracked his little idiosyncrasy was he would track every time he killed a monster. I mean, within like a month, his entire back sheet was covered in tick marks. It's like, okay, so we're all mass murderers. I mean, of sentience, and that should, if we're not in the D&D world, if we're in another game world, or a world that's slightly realistic, that should affect your character.
If you have a soul,
exactly.
that should affect you, a little bit too. The other thing with like the long backstory people. I'm not going to say all, but many of them get really upset if you do anything to that backstory. It's like very precious to them. Like, right. So they give you all this stuff to use, but then they don't want you to use it. Like if they describe their aunt, like, and then you go back and go, well, no, actually your aunt was a doppelganger the whole time. They're going to be like, that's not the story I wrote. And I've seen that happen as well.
Well, it's almost like when we were talking about, like their PCs, if their PCs get hurt permanently, or maimed or whatever. And again, I understand why, but it's also similar to the backstory. It's like, well, you know what, your aunt was captured, or here's a note from somebody else, your aunt's village got burned to the ground and there were no survivors. I mean, like, and yes, that's kind of an extreme example, but if you look at any fantasy movie, that probably happened at one point or another, where, that's Star Wars. I mean, that's Lord of the Rings. It's everything. All those things happen. So you kind of have to be open to those things and have those drive you. And again, I think that's, as a tangent, that does remember one of the things we were talking about before about the players not being quite so powerful, the character's not, is I very specifically also write in the Whispers adventures and scenarios that this is what happens if they don't win. Winning it, to me, should not be a foregone conclusion. And I know a lot of people play that way, and I have absolutely I don't think that's bad. I don't think that's wrong at all in any way, shape, or form. And if you've watched my work, Harper's Tale is the book I wrote for my daughter, or with my daughter. Yes, you should win that game. That's kind of the point. But all of my other games tend to be like, if you don't win, that's okay. Win the next time, or the time after that, or the time after that. And again, I kind of always like to say it. So, me sitting down at a table for 2 to 3, 4 hours with my friends is winning. That's actually where I won. It's not my character. It's me getting to play a game, and what my character does is kind of secondary, honestly, in a lot of cases.
The like we had a scenario in one of our games, and I don't really write when they don't win, but I generally Well, I have some ideas, and I do a lot of improv DMing anyway, so I guess it doesn't matter as much. So, like, they had a choice. They basically discovered this, like, buried, derelict spaceship and accidentally freed this kaiju-like monster. Or they came on the scene and when it was freed. So they had the choice of exploring the ruin or going after the monster. Well, they chose to go after the monster. Well, it wasn't a monster they were just going to be able to fight and kill. It was far more powerful than them. So eventually they realized that, so they go back to the ship to try and figure out if there's a way to stop the monster. And there was. But the problem was that it took so long for them to do that, and they wasted so much time, that the monster made it to a major city in our world that doesn't exist anymore. So like that was the consequences of things that happened in the game. That was a case where, they didn't necessarily win, that particular adventure. Nothing personally happened to them, but at the same time they had to recognize and realize, just because they came to a fork in the road and they went right instead of left, here's the consequences of that.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I think that's fantastic. And having things happen away from them really adds a lot to your world, whatever your world is. I mean, in any kind of genre, any kind of gaming situation or any kind of story, there's a lot of stuff that's going to go on away from them. Honestly, most of the things going to go on away from them. And I think that's the coolest thing to do. That's funny, like, because that happened in one of the things with Sandy when I wrote the adventure path. It's 14 adventures, I think, and afterwards we have a section or two. I wrote a couple pages like, well, what do you do after? You've just done this enormous thing. You've just stopped this elder god. What's next? And one of them is literally like, do you remember that worm you didn't kill back in 3 episodes ago? That was a doll. It was a baby doll. It's not a baby anymore, and it's coming after you. Stuff like that. And I think that's the most fun, and I think that's great, is that you have and you bring back other stuff, and even if it wasn't going to be important, make it important now. And then you can just pretend like it was your plan all along.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, for most of my adventure writing, it happens during the session, not before. For that reason, whether it's because it's just something that they missed or overlooked, or it's just something that they mentioned in an offhand comment, I'll make a note, that thing is now going to be way more important than it originally was going to be.
Oh gosh, yeah. Those were some of the most fun things. I wanted to do it. I keep not having time, is to grab, like, you remember those old monster cards from the AD&D ones that were whatever, big, like little postcards that were so cool. And I think they're like $100 now if you try to find them on eBay or something. But, Inkwell makes monster cards, and I think actually a lot of folks make them now. And I did this a few times. Is I had a map that I knew what was in the room. So like either like a Dyson map where they're actually really well drawn out, or Devon, or Dark Realms. Like, we have a lot of cartographers that actually the maps are so good that I can just look at the map and describe it without reading it. And what we would do is I would actually have those monster cards behind my screen with me, and then I would just pick as we went, and I would you do the entire thing basically on the fly because you have all the stuff in front of you. So much easier. And I think that would be a great concept to do, like a little game where an adventure that says, all right, here's my module, here's these 20 monster cards you need, here's these 5 treasure cards you need, like everything that you need all in one little thing, and then you just go. That would be about as easy a DM prep as you could possibly have. Is you get the monster card, you hold it up with the picture on this side and the stats on that side, and say, this is what you see, and then you just do your thing.
Yeah,
we did that at my table, and it was fun, and it was so much easier. I mean, it was
some old school as well.
Yeah.
Were you using like treasure decks as well?
I like all that stuff. I don't know. Maybe I'm like a gadget person, gun junkie. I love the condition cards and the monster cards, and I've been really good about not buying that stuff lately, but I love all that stuff. I would love to have a deck of I even have the Call of Cthulhu Madness cards, which are super cool looking.
I am the type of person that will buy that stuff and then never use it.
Yes, I finally am slowing down on that. Yeah.
Like, it sounds like a great idea, and they are cool. and then when the rubber hits the road for whatever reason, I just don't use them. Yeah, I did the same thing with the spell cards, and I mean, I buy so much D&D books and have so much D&D stuff, but at the end of the day, I generally just use, a lot of the core rules or whatever I pull up on D&D Beyond, and then just make stuff up
Yep.
on the fly. Like you were talking about earlier about how many words for a 2-hour session. I was like, I generally run like 3 to 4 hour sessions off of like 3 sentences.
Mm-hmm. You can. Oh, absolutely. Like I don't remember if it was Mike Shea or who it was, but, and maybe I'm sure it's come up over the years more than once, is postcards.
Yeah.
And I've done that too. It's like, I got 6 postcards, 5 postcards, and they're written in a way, again, with the map that they can fit anywhere and they can fit in any spot. And that's like with, so when I did Tales of the Margrave Margrave, I always say it differently every time. I created a lot of encounter tables, and I'm very specifically not saying random encounter tables because I don't like them to be random, but I love encounter tables. And the encounter tables that I create tend to be a sentence or 2 or 3. And it's not you see 6 bugbears. It's you find a sword buried to the hilt in a dying oak tree in the middle of the forest, surrounded by whatever. Something much more evocative details.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a story hook. Each one is. And again, in that case, like you said, you can do 2 sentences and you can play for an hour.
Yeah, I mean, also,
or even a campaign. I mean,
it depends on your players a lot of times too. Like if you have a table that just likes to do stuff, you need very little as a DM. You might throw out a hook here or there, or you might need an encounter to throw out and keep in your back pocket when there's a slowdown. But generally, those players will just start coming up with their own things to do, or they'll take the smallest thing that you throw out there, and now all of a sudden, it's it becomes a huge arc in the campaign, and I love that when it happens.
Yep.
I love when I can just show up as a dungeon master and just facilitate the game that the players want to play.
Right.
And that can be a lot more difficult for players that want to be kind of like spoon-fed their adventure. I mean, I can do that as well, but I think I found that I don't enjoy it quite as much.
Yeah. Well, we had one of the last campaigns I ran was they found like a broken rod, and it was part of something else. And as we were playing through it, the player decided that he thought it might be a piece of the rod of 7 parts. I'm like, you know what? I think you're right. I think it is. Now we have a plan for the next, however long we play. And it's going to mess you up because it's so lawful, and it's going to make you lawful. And all, I mean, it was actually super funny. And it was funny because it ended up, the rod, as pieces were given to it, of course, it grows in power and it gets stronger. And it chose somebody else eventually because he kept making his save to not have his alignment match the rods. So the rod's like, screw you, I'm going somewhere else. But that's, like you said, when the players really want to do that sort of stuff and really kind of buy into it, they feed you everything. Or at least they give you so much to work with.
Yeah, and like, I mean, one of the things that we've seen time and time again from, different comments and messages is like, oh, my players won't take my hooks. And it's like, well, it's probably because your hooks aren't good. Like, and not in the sense that like they wrote a bad hook, but in the sense it was a bad hook for that group, for those players. Right? Like, anytime you can take that hook and pull it out of one of your players and then regurgitate it, re-gift it to them, like it's going to be effortless. They're going to take it every time because it pertains to them. Like, just listen. As a dungeon master, you should spend more time listening to your players than talking when you get the chance. And then take notes.
Well, I think it's almost like the DM version of the backstory that goes so detailed and so specific. If your hook is really specific, be ready for it not to really resonate with them. That's why a hook, which is literally like the one I always remember is you find a tree in the middle of the forest with a sword stuck to the hilt, in the tree itself. That's vague. that's vague enough that somebody's going to find some reason why they want to get that, and at the very least, they want that sword now, and they want to pull that thing out. And so maybe the tree doesn't like it, maybe the sword doesn't like it, maybe the tree is being pinned because of who knows? It could be anything. And as they go, then you can adjust. But yeah, I think that's it too, is not allowing there to be enough flexibility to adjust to and incorporate kind of what they want and what they need to get out of the session.
Yeah, so like a hook like that is great. Like the dying tree, sword buried up to the hilt. And then full stop, right? Because now...
Yeah, that's the thing is you got to stop, too. I think that's the thing is DMs want to keep talking. Like, no. And I even tell this, like, outside. It's like, when you say this, I want you to put a period there. And I want you to be quiet. And wait.
Right. Because the chances that they'll just go, like, let's just keep going isn't very likely, right? Because it's a bit of a mystery. Is the sword valuable? Who put the sword there? Like... As the DM, you don't need to ask these questions. What you need to do, in my opinion, is listen to the players and see what questions they ask. Right? Because they're kind of telling you what interests them. And if you can then take that information and feed it back to them, like you have a whole adventure. You have a campaign, because they've already said, this is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, gosh, you could do so much. Like, all right, so they're going to have to do a strength check to pull it out. And they make the first strength check. It moves 2 inches, and you see the beginnings of a piece of writing on the blade.
Yeah.
So it moves 2 more inches, and the tree starts to change. Or you get an audience, some creature, all of a sudden there's a bunch of deer that are watching you intelligently, or wolves or whatever. So, yeah, that's what it is just seeing what they do next. And maybe they want to chop down the tree instead of pull out the sword. Who knows? Maybe they'll burn the tree down. I don't know. Fireballs are fun.
Yeah, you never know what the players are going to do.
No, fire can be involved all the time, though.
That's true. One of the sessions I ran for my family, they totally trying to take out a couple of drow hunting them, burned down most of the forest, and then then they started trying to put it out. Had a druid show up, blamed the drow, blamed the fire on the drow.
It wasn't me.
Yeah, it is very believable. Oh, of course the drow were trying to burn down the forest. But it turns out we were the villains all along.
Yeah. I think that's the thing, too, is people don't realize how bad some of their players are. If you put you look at it from a different context, and that's a lot of what we talk about in Whispers too. Is like making sure they understand. It's like, you can't just go around beating up people and killing them. There are police.
D&D is very strange that way. It's like, depending on your players, especially like young players, like this, they like to push the boundaries and see what they can do and get away with.
Right.
Young people in general do that anyway, but then give them a game where there may be consequences, but they're not real consequences.
Right.
Little kids always love to steal. Like that seems to be like a reoccurring thing. Like it's like tweens, I've noticed.
Yeah, Harper, my 9-year-old, likes to be stabby. She wants to be a stabby rogue. That's all she wants to do. And of course, I tell her backstab because I still think a sneak attack is backstab.
Yeah.
Despite I don't even know the last time they actually used that game term, but it was in the red book, so it's in there forever for me. She's like, I sneak up and I backstab.
Yeah.
That's all she does. She just wants. I'm just gonna backstab everybody.
Well, you gotta have everyone has their thing, right?
Yeah, that's her skill, and that's what she's sticking with.
Yeah, we started streaming a game where it's like we've got 4 kids in the game, aging from 19 to 13, right? And then three of us that are old guys, and the very first encounter, one of the kids is like, we're trying to solve a problem, and one of the NPCs having the problem. He's like, I want to pickpocket that NPC, as the rest of us are like trying to fix this problem.
Right.
And I find that's kind of typical.
It is, and I think that's funny too, because that's another thing with skills. Like, there's that the thing that always goes around. It's like, well, just because you can try, and just because you roll a 20, doesn't mean you can actually do it. And that's something that I kind of stick to. I mean, unless you're actually doing combat, there is no such thing as an automatic success or fail. Um,
Saving throws and attack rolls. That's it.
right, and so that's the other thing. It's like, well, I seduce the whatever, or I pickpocket the king in front of the court. Well, you can try. I rolled a 20. I'm like, okay, you went to jail. All the guards, because you walked up in front of 50 people to attempt to do this. It wasn't, it doesn't matter how sneaky you are, you did it. And that's kind of another interesting thing too, is actually with what we're doing with Whispers is, again, since it's much more skill focused, we will do stuff that there are fumbles, there are critical successes and auto 10s, and maybe even an auto 20. If you do, if you spend a day in the library, yes, you automatically get a X or whatever else. But anyway, you got me on a tangent, or at least I think I got myself on that tangent. But.
That's quite okay. So Brian says PC1 backstab, PC2 steals gold, PC3 cast fireball on them all. Yeah, that kind of sums up the players. 3 of the players that'll show up at your table.
Yep. Well, so we had that happen at one of the games I ran. Was a very dark game, all adults at the table, and one of the guys was new. And I tell the story. I've told the story a million times. And they had just gotten to third level spells, and they were like having kind of a tense confrontation with a gang in an urban environment. And behind the gang were a group of like kind of doxies and just people that were kind of watching, because the gang was, again, this is a part of town where the gang actually controlled basically everything. And the gang leader pushed the party spokesperson, and so the character is a wizard. It's like, I fireball, like, okay. And he fireball, and he literally killed 20 people.
That escalated quickly.
It did, actually. So that encounter was done, and then the next encounter was the police coming and putting them in jail, and that didn't work out well, because now they were wanted for killing 30 people or 20 people. The Doxies Guild sent them a bill for lost wages because they lost like half of their workers.
Yeah.
And all this. I mean, actually, it drove the campaign. Actually, it made the campaign much different than I had originally thought. Because again, you have to let the players do what they want to do, and then kind of take it from there. And we all had a great time with it. Actually, it was a lot of fun. But that's the thing. That's Brian's answer to everything. I throw a fireball. And how many bystanders do I get? And that's the second question usually.
Yeah. So, yes, the Trask is terrifying, but have you ever heard of bureaucracy? So,
I sent them a bill. I photoshopped a bill from the Guild of Doxies, and it was itemized for replacement training, lost wages, bereavement payout. I mean, it was everything. And they were pissed. It was pretty funny, actually. And then the police, because they were working with the guards, and the cops we can't work with you anymore. And so, they used up all their political favors that they had been gaining the entire time to do something else, used them all up to get out of jail.
That's
and
funny.
To smooth it over again.
Real quick, I just want to mention everyone down in the comments, the pinned comment, you can find links to check out Matt and his projects that he's been working on. Follow along, check it out. With that, we've come up to the hour. Final words before we head out, Matt?
What's that, sir?
Final words before we head out?
Yeah, so you can find me at Twitter at Matthew D. Corley. Whispers in the Dark is probably what I'm kind of mostly known for at this moment, but I do also publish horror novels. I have a Kickstarter coming for a horror novella that will eventually tie into a game. In September, Whispers Core Rule Book will be a Kickstarter after that. One thing I kind of forgot is when we're talking about horror, I mean, anytime you do play a horror game, just make sure everybody at your table wants to play a horror game. And also that you guys are all on the same page on what is and is not acceptable. There's a huge range there. And I think that's probably one thing that horror gets a good and a bad rap for, is that, sometimes not everybody likes the same stuff, and what may be acceptable to you may not be to one of your players. So we want to make sure we always, again, we want to play our horror games, but we want to, again, make sure we're all being on the same page on what is okay and what isn't. And if anybody ever wants to chat or anything, just hit me up on Twitter.
Thank you so much. It's been fun chatting. Yeah, I feel like there's so much more we could have talked about, but an hour goes by so fast. We'll have to have you on again.
It does.
So
I would love to come back sometime.
Absolutely. So with that, until next time, everyone, stay nerdy.
All right. Bye, everybody.